What would you do if your own family, the people who were supposed to love and protect you, threw you out into the cold the moment you needed them the most? At just 20, I found myself homeless, pregnant, and abandoned, all because I refused to erase my own child. But years later, I returned, not as the broken girl they left behind, but with a secret so shocking, it would bring their carefully built empire crashing down. Growing up, my family prided themselves on their reputation: perfect house, perfect children, perfect image. My father, a powerful attorney, built his entire career on preaching about family values. My mother played the role of the ever-dignified wife, ensuring we lived up to impossible standards. And my sister? She was the golden child who could do no wrong. Then there was me, Olivia, the rebellious one, the constant disappointment. But nothing I ever did compared to what they considered my ultimate betrayal. I got pregnant. And in an instant, I was erased from their lives, like I had never existed. But fate has a funny way of turning the tables. Because when I finally came back, I wasn't alone. I had uncovered a family secret so devastating, it would change everything. Growing up, my family wasn't just strict, they were ruthless when it came to maintaining their image. My father, Richard, was a powerhouse in the legal world, a man whose words could sway a courtroom with chilling precision. He wasn't just respected, he was feared. My mother, Eleanor, was the perfect politician's wife, orchestrating every social event, every charitable appearance, making sure that not a single hair of our family's reputation was out of place. And then there was my sister, Sophia, the golden child, the one who never disappointed, never stepped out of line. She was their pride and joy. I, on the other hand, was their biggest liability. From the moment I was old enough to form my own opinions, I became a problem they needed to fix. Rules in our house weren't just guidelines, they were absolute. Sit straight. Speak properly. Dress appropriately. No backtalk. No friends they didn't approve of. No imperfections. If my father was the judge, my mother was the silent executioner, enforcing order through icy glares and whispered warnings about what the neighbors would think. But I never played by their rules. I pushed back, questioned everything, dared to have a voice in a family where silence was expected. At 17, I started seeing Brandon, a guy who, in their eyes, was all wrong. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't come from a prestigious family. He worked as a server at a small Italian restaurant, barely making ends meet while attending college. I knew my parents would disapprove, so I kept it a secret, sneaking out whenever I could just to feel like I had some control over my life. For a while, it felt like I was finally breaking free, carving out a space that belonged to me. But freedom is a fragile thing. And mine shattered the moment I saw 2 pink lines on a plastic test in a gas station bathroom. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the late-night studying. But 5 tests later, the truth was undeniable: I was pregnant. Panic clawed at my chest as I thought about telling Brandon. I rehearsed the words over and over, imagining every possible reaction. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for the way his expression hardened when I finally told him. "You need to get rid of it," he said, his voice flat, distant. "We're too young for this. It'll ruin our lives." I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. This was the guy who told me he loved me. The guy who swore he'd always be there. And yet, in the moment I needed him most, he became a stranger. "Get out," I whispered, my hands trembling. "I never want to see you again." And he didn't fight. He just left. But the hardest part was still ahead of me. Telling my parents was like stepping onto a battlefield completely unarmed. I waited until after dinner, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear my own voice. "I have something to tell you." The rustling of the newspaper stopped. My father slowly lowered it, his cold gaze locking onto me. My mother set down her fork, her lips already pressed into a tight, disapproving line. Sophia stood in the background, her expression unreadable. I swallowed hard. "I'm pregnant." The silence was deafening. Then, my father's face turned red with rage as he slammed his fist onto the table. "You've disgraced this family," he roared, his voice shaking with fury. "After everything we've done for you? You think you can throw away your future like this?" My mother burst into tears, not out of sadness for me, but for what people would say. "Do you have any idea what this will do to us?" she sobbed. "To your father's career?" And then came the final blow. "You will have an abortion," my father said, his tone deathly calm. "We will handle it quietly. No one has to know about this mistake." I felt like the room was spinning. For a brief moment, I wavered. Maybe they were right. Maybe it would be easier. Maybe I could just erase this and pretend it never happened. But then I heard a voice, my own voice, ringing in my head, reminding me of the one thing I had that they never could take away, my choice. "No." My mother gasped. Sophia's eyes widened. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break his teeth. "Excuse me?" I said no, I repeated, my voice stronger this time. "I'm keeping my baby." What followed was a blur of shouting, insults, and ultimatums. But in the end, there was only one conclusion. "Get out," my father finally said, his voice like ice. "Pack your things. You are no longer my daughter." My mother didn't argue. Sophia didn't speak. And just like that, I was erased. Before I tell you what happened next, the moment that silenced an entire press conference, I want to connect with all of you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to stand up for something you believed in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. I remember standing in my bedroom, staring at the half-empty suitcase on my bed, my hands trembling as I shoved in whatever clothes I could grab. My father's words still echoed in my head, cold, final. "You are no longer my daughter." I wasn't just being thrown out of my house. I was being erased. When I stepped out of my room, my mother was standing at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought, hoped, that she would stop me. That she would soften, even just a little, and tell me that I wasn't alone. But instead, she just turned her face away. I walked past her, past Sophia, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything. She didn't defend me. She didn't even meet my eyes. I stepped outside, the night air sharp against my skin, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The door slammed shut behind me, a sound so final it sent a shiver down my spine. And just like that, I was alone. I had no plan. Nowhere to go. No one to call. Brandon had made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with me. My so-called friends? They were just as afraid of my father as I was, and I knew better than to expect their help. Then, as if some last shred of instinct kicked in, I remembered one person who might still care. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed. The line rang once. Twice. Then a familiar voice, warm and steady, answered. "Olivia? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Tears spilled down my cheeks at the sound of my Aunt Margaret's voice. She was my mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family, the one who never fit into my parents' perfectly curated world. I had only met her a handful of times, she lived in another state, far from my parents' suffocating rules, but I had always felt a strange sense of comfort around her. And in that moment, she was the only person I could think to call. Through sobs, I told her everything. There was a long silence. Then, finally, she spoke. "Stay right where you are. I'm coming to get you." The hours that followed were a blur. I sat on the curb in front of my house, hugging my knees to my chest, flinching every time a car passed by, half expecting my father to storm outside and drag me back in. But he never did. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance, and before I could even process what was happening, Aunt Margaret was in front of me, pulling me into her arms. "You're safe now," she whispered, smoothing my hair as I broke down against her shoulder. "I've got you." For the first time that night, I let myself believe it. Margaret took me back to her home, a small but cozy house in a quiet town miles away from the chaos I had left behind. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't pristine or perfect like my parents' house. But it was warm. It was safe. And for the first time in my life, I could breathe. The next few weeks were a blur of exhaustion, nausea, and overwhelming fear. Margaret helped me schedule my first doctor's appointment, made sure I was eating, and most importantly, she listened. She never made me feel ashamed. Never made me feel like I had ruined my life. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, she placed a hand over mine. "I know you're scared, Olivia. But you're stronger than you think. And this baby? It doesn't mean your life is over. It just means you have to fight a little harder for the life you want." I didn't know it then, but she was right. Slowly, I started rebuilding. I found a job waiting tables at a small diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me on my feet. And when Margaret saw how determined I was, she encouraged me to enroll in community college. "You don't have to let them decide your future, sweetheart. You get to write your own story now." So I did. It wasn't easy. Juggling work, school, and pregnancy was exhausting. There were days when I felt like giving up, days when I broke down crying in my tiny bedroom, missing the family that had turned their backs on me. But I pushed forward. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't living under someone else's expectations. I was finally free. Years passed. My son, Nathan, was born, a perfect, beautiful boy who became the center of my world. I worked harder than I ever had before, determined to build a future for us. I climbed my way up from waitress to manager. I saved every penny. And eventually, I opened my own cafe, something I never would have dreamed possible back when I was trapped in my parents' suffocating world. I had everything I needed. A home. A career. A son who I adored. But life has a funny way of bringing ghosts back to haunt you. One night, years later, I was scrolling through my phone when a news article caught my eye. There, on my screen, was a face I hadn't seen in years. Richard Anderson, my father. And right beside him, my mother and Sophia, standing perfectly poised and polished. The headline sent a chill down my spine. High-profile attorney Richard Anderson announces mayoral candidacy, a man of integrity and family values. My stomach twisted. Family values. Integrity. They had no idea what those words meant. And that's when I realized, I wasn't done with them yet. The years that followed were the hardest of my life. I had nothing, no parents, no savings, no plan. Just a tiny, growing life inside me and a deep, aching fear that I had made a mistake. But there was no going back. I had made my choice, and I was going to fight for it. Living with Aunt Margaret was a blessing, but it didn't erase the struggle. She helped as much as she could, but she wasn't rich. She lived paycheck to paycheck, managing a small bookstore in town, and taking me in meant an extra mouth to feed. I knew I couldn't just sit around waiting for things to get better, I had to make them better. So I found a job at a local diner, the kind of place with sticky tables, flickering neon signs, and regulars who ordered the same thing every morning. I worked long shifts, balancing trays on my swollen feet, faking smiles for rude customers, and pretending I wasn't terrified about the future. At night, exhaustion sank deep into my bones, but I couldn't rest. I lay awake thinking about my son. I hadn't even met him yet, but he was already the center of my universe. I wanted to give him everything, a safe home, a good life, a mother who wasn't drowning in regret. And then, one night, Aunt Margaret said something that changed everything. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp overhead. She watched me push food around my plate, my mind tangled with worries I couldn't even put into words. "You should go back to school," she said suddenly. I scoffed. "School? Margaret, I can barely afford groceries. How am I supposed to afford college?" She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You're smart, Olivia. you're driven. And you're not just doing this for yourself anymore, you're doing this for him. Her eyes flickered down to my stomach. There are scholarships, financial aid. You can take night classes, work during the day. It won't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever is. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list all the reasons why it was impossible. But deep down, I knew she was right. So I did it. I enrolled in a local community college, signing up for a business management program. At first, it felt like I was drowning. Between work, school, and pregnancy, I barely had time to breathe. There were nights I cried from exhaustion, days I questioned if I could really do this. But every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself why I was doing it. And then, Nathan was born. I'll never forget the moment I held him for the first time. His tiny fingers curled around mine, his eyes, my eyes, staring up at me like I was his whole world. In that moment, everything shifted. The fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, it all faded. I was a mother now. And I would never let my son feel the kind of rejection I had endured. The next few years were a blur of diapers, textbooks, and sleepless nights. I worked every shift I could, studied between naps, and somehow, against all odds, I started to climb my way up. The diner's owner, Evelyn, noticed my work ethic. One night, after closing up, she pulled me aside. "You ever think about running your own place one day?" she asked, wiping down the counter. I laughed. "Sure, in another lifetime where I have time and money." She smirked. "You've got something, Olivia. You don't just work, you think. You notice what customers like, how things can run smoother. That's the kind of person who builds something bigger than this." Her words planted a seed in my mind, an idea I didn't dare speak aloud yet. But it grew. By the time Nathan was 5, I had earned my degree. The day I walked across that stage in my cap and gown, I scanned the crowd and found Aunt Margaret, tears streaming down her face. And in the front row, sitting on her lap, was Nathan, clapping his tiny hands. I had done it. But the fight wasn't over. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I wanted more. I wanted security. Stability. A future where I didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. So I kept pushing. I worked my way up from waitress to manager. I saved every tip, every bonus, every extra penny I could. And then, after years of struggle, I did something my father never would have expected. I opened my own cafe. It wasn't fancy, just a small place on a quiet corner, but it was mine. A place where people felt welcome, where no one was judged for where they came from or what mistakes they had made. For the first time in my life, I felt safe. I had a home. I had a career. And most importantly, I had Nathan, my perfect, bright-eyed boy who reminded me every day that I had made the right choice. But just when I thought I had finally escaped my past, it came crashing back into my life. It happened on a slow afternoon. The cafe was quiet, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. I was wiping down the counter when my phone buzzed. Absent-mindedly, I glanced at the screen. And then, my heart stopped. There, staring back at me, was a headline I never expected to see. Attorney Richard Anderson announces run for mayor, a man of integrity and family values. I gripped the counter, my vision swimming. Integrity. Family values. The hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. I thought I had left that world behind. I thought I had moved on. But in that moment, I knew, I wasn't done with them yet. The words on my phone screen blurred as a wave of emotions crashed over me. Integrity. Family values. My father had built an entire campaign on the very things he had denied me. He had thrown me away like I was nothing, erased me from existence, and now he was standing in front of cameras, smiling like the perfect family man. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. But more than that, I was tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending that the past didn't haunt me. I had spent years clawing my way out of the darkness he had left me in, building something of my own. I had a son who loved me. A business that I had built from the ground up. A life that I had fought for. But a part of me still ached. A part of me still longed for something more. That's when I met him. It happened at one of Nathan's baseball games. He had just turned 6, and I had signed him up for a little league team to give him something I never had, a normal childhood. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the sun high in the sky, kids in matching jerseys running across the field with endless energy. Parents lined the bleachers, cheering and chatting. I was so focused on Nathan, on the way his little legs carried him across the dirt, that I didn't notice the man sitting next to me until he spoke. "Your kid?" he asked, nodding toward Nathan. I turned and met a pair of warm, brown eyes. The man had an easy smile, the kind that made you feel safe without even realizing why. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Yours?" He chuckled. "That little tornado over there." He pointed to a boy on the opposing team, a few inches taller than Nathan, grinning as he adjusted his cap. "Tyler." I smiled. "Looks like they're going to be rivals today." "Looks like it," he agreed. "I'm Ethan, by the way." That was how it started. A simple conversation on a set of metal bleachers, two single parents making small talk while our sons played baseball. But as the weeks went by, those conversations grew longer. Deeper. Ethan was a widower. His wife had passed away when Tyler was just a baby, leaving him to navigate fatherhood alone. He knew what it was like to struggle, to build a life from the ground up. He understood responsibility in a way most men didn't. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. We took things slow. At first, we were just two parents, meeting up after games, grabbing coffee while our boys played. Then, one night, he invited me to dinner. I hesitated. I hadn't let anyone in for years. But there was something about Ethan, his patience, his kindness, the way he never pushed me to be anything other than myself. So I said yes. One date turned into two. Two turned into late-night phone calls, laughter over takeout, stolen glances that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Nathan adored him. Tyler became like a brother to my son. And little by little, the walls I had built so carefully around myself began to crack. But just as I was learning to open my heart again, the past came knocking. One evening, as Ethan and I sat on the couch watching the boys build a pillow fort, my phone buzzed. I picked it up without thinking, expecting it to be a work email or a reminder about Nathan's school project. Instead, it was a name I hadn't seen in years. Sophia. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. My heart pounded in my chest. Ethan noticed. "Everything okay?" I swallowed hard. "It's my sister." His brows lifted slightly, but he didn't press. He never did. He just nodded, squeezing my hand as if to say I'm here. Taking a deep breath, I stood and walked into the kitchen, my hands shaking as I answered the call. "Olivia." Sophia's voice was softer than I remembered. "Hey." I exhaled slowly. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," she admitted. I saw Dad's campaign announcement. And I thought about you. About everything." There was a pause, then a quiet confession. "I miss you." I didn't know how to respond to that. For years, I had convinced myself that Sophia had been just as bad as our parents. That her silence had been a betrayal. But now, hearing the hesitation in her voice, the uncertainty, I realized something. Maybe she hadn't been my enemy. Maybe she had just been a scared girl, trapped in the same house I had once been. "Why are you calling, Sophia?" My voice was careful, guarded. She hesitated. "Because I think you should know something." And then, in the quiet of my kitchen, my sister told me a secret that sent my world spinning all over again. "I don't even know how to say this," Sophia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But you deserve to know the truth. I gripped the kitchen counter, bracing myself. Just say it, Sophia. She inhaled sharply. We weren't Dad's first family. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. What? Before you and me, before Mom even, she continued, Dad had another family. A wife. A son. The words hit me like a freight train. My stomach twisted, my pulse roaring in my ears. No, I murmured, shaking my head. That doesn't make sense. I didn't believe it either, she admitted. Not at first. But I found documents. Old court records. Dad was married years ago, before he met Mom. And they had a child. Had? The past tense sent a cold chill through me. Sophia hesitated. When the baby was born, there were complications. He had severe disabilities. Dad, he left them. My breath caught in my throat. Left? Abandoned, she corrected, voice heavy with something I had never heard from her before, shame. He paid off the hospital bills, made sure they disappeared from his life. Mom never knew. No one did. The room around me spun. I gripped the counter tighter, as if letting go would send me crashing to the floor. How do you know all this? Because I found him, Olivia, she whispered. I found our brother. I felt my legs give out. I collapsed into a chair, my mind racing to process what she was saying. A brother. A living, breathing person out there, cast aside like I had been. Where is he now? I asked, my voice barely holding steady. He's alive, she said. And not just alive, he's thriving. His name is Michael. He was adopted by a family who gave him everything Dad refused to. He's a published author now. And she hesitated. He knows about us. I sucked in a sharp breath. He knows? He's known for years, she admitted. But he never tried to find us. He said he had made peace with the past. I let out a bitter laugh. Peace? Dad erased him, and he's supposed to just accept it? I don't know, Olivia, Sophia said softly. I just thought you should know. I thought. She trailed off. I clenched my jaw, emotions swirling in my chest, rage, disbelief, sorrow. Does Dad know you found him? No, she admitted. But I'm sure it won't be long before he does. A silence stretched between us. There was so much to say, yet no words felt adequate. Finally, Sophia spoke again. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I stood by while you suffered. I know I was weak. But Olivia, if there's a chance to make things right, even just a little, I had to take it. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. What do you expect me to do with this, Sophia? That's up to you, she said. But Michael's having a book signing next week. It's in the city. If you want to meet him, that's your chance. A book signing. A public event. My father's campaign was in full swing. He was riding high, parading his so-called family values across every news station, every political rally. And he had no idea that the son he had thrown away was about to step into the spotlight. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening on the phone. Send me the details, I said. Sophia hesitated. Olivia. I'm going. My voice was firm. I could practically hear the relief in her sigh. I'll text you everything. I hung up, my fingers still clenched around the phone. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating my next move. For years, my father had controlled the narrative. He had dictated who mattered, who was worthy of love, who deserved to be part of his perfect world. Now, it was time to rewrite the story. I was done hiding. The night before the book signing, I barely slept. My mind was a storm, memories of my father's cold, unforgiving voice clashing against the new reality I was about to walk into. A brother. A living, breathing part of me that had been stolen before I even knew he existed. By the time morning came, I was running on adrenaline. I dressed carefully, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed I was there to start a war. But inside, every nerve in my body was preparing for battle. Ethan noticed. As I stood by the mirror, adjusting my jacket for the 10th time, he walked up behind me, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, Olivia." I met his eyes in the reflection. Warm. Steady. "I know," I said. "But I do have to do it." The event was being held in one of the city's upscale bookstores, the kind with chandeliers hanging above the shelves and velvet armchairs placed in cozy corners. When I arrived, the space was already filling up. People milled around, holding copies of Michael Lawson's latest book. I spotted him immediately. Michael was seated at a signing table near the front, engaged in conversation with a reader. He looked nothing like our father, where Richard Anderson was sharp edges and practiced smiles. Michael was relaxed, his expression open and kind. His wheelchair sat beside the table, a quiet reminder of the reason our father had deemed him unworthy. For a moment, I just stood there, watching him. Studying the way he laughed, the ease with which he interacted with strangers. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't broken. He had built a life outside of the shadows of the man who had abandoned him. And now, I was about to step into it. Taking a deep breath, I moved forward. When it was finally my turn, Michael looked up, ready to greet another reader. Then he froze. His eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe. Or just surprise. "You're Olivia." It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. He set down his pen. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he finally said. "I wasn't sure either." My voice was quieter than I intended. "I only found out about you a few days ago." His smile was small, but not unkind. "That must have been a shock." "That's one way to put it." He studied me, then gestured toward the empty seat beside his table. "Want to sit?" I did. And for the next half hour, we talked. Not about our father. Not about the years we had lost. But about us. About his childhood, his adoptive family, the way he had always known there was a piece of him missing but had chosen to move forward anyway. "I never wanted to chase ghosts," he admitted, flipping his pen between his fingers. But when I saw the campaign, when I heard him talking about family values like he hadn't abandoned two of his own children, I realized something. "What?" His eyes met mine. "Maybe it's time the truth came out." And just like that, we had an unspoken agreement. The next morning, the media was buzzing. Photos from the book signing were already making the rounds online. Author Michael Lawson meets long-lost sister, Anderson family scandal? I could only imagine my father's reaction when he saw them. But I didn't have to imagine for long. That afternoon, my phone rang. An unknown number. But I knew. I let it ring twice before answering. "Olivia," my father's voice was sharp, controlled, anger barely restrained beneath a thin layer of civility. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. "Having a conversation with my brother." "You remember him, don't you?" A beat of silence. Then, a cold chuckle. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "No, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "You don't." I hung up before he could respond. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The confrontation didn't happen right away. My father wasn't the type to lash out publicly, no, he preferred to control the narrative, to handle things behind closed doors where he could manipulate, threaten, and destroy without leaving a trace. But this time, he was losing control. The media had already picked up the story. The campaign office had gone into damage control, issuing a carefully worded statement about family privacy and misunderstandings. But no amount of PR spin could erase the truth. Richard Anderson, the so-called pillar of integrity, had abandoned not one, but two of his children. And now, both of us were back. So I knew it was only a matter of time before he made his move. It happened 3 days later. I was closing up my cafe for the night when a sleek black car pulled up outside. The kind of car that didn't belong on my quiet little street. I didn't have to see who stepped out to know. I left the lights off, standing behind the counter as the door swung open and my father walked in. He was still dressed like a politician, expensive suit, perfect posture, the mask of confidence that had fooled so many for so long. But I saw it now. The tension in his jaw. The barely concealed fury in his eyes. "Olivia," he greeted, voice smooth as ever. "I was hoping we could talk." "Funny," I said, folding my arms. "I don't remember you ever wanting to talk before." He exhaled sharply. "You've made your point. You're angry. I understand that. But this? Stirring up the past? Going public? That was a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice eerily calm. "No, Dad. The mistake was thinking you could erase people just because they didn't fit into your perfect little world." His expression hardened. "I didn't come here to argue." "Then why are you here?" I asked, tilting my head. "Damage control? Trying to cut a deal?" His jaw clenched. "I came to offer you a choice." I let out a dry laugh. "A choice? Like the one you gave me when you threw me out? Or the one you gave Michael when you abandoned him?" He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "If you drop this, stop feeding the media, stay out of my way, I will make sure you're taken care of. Financially. Whatever you need. A house. A trust fund for your son. A fresh start." I stared at him, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "You think this is about money?" My voice was cold now, sharp enough to cut. "You really think that after all these years, after everything you did, you can just buy me off?" His expression didn't change. "Everyone has a price, Olivia." I shook my head, stepping forward until there was barely a foot of space between us. "You still don't get it, do you? I don't need anything from you. Not your money. Not your approval. Not your name. I built a life without you. I built something real, something you'll never understand, because everything you have is built on lies." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty. I pressed on. "You spent your whole life trying to control people. Trying to silence the truth. But guess what, Dad? You don't get to control this. You don't get to rewrite history. Michael and I? We exist. And the world is finally going to see you for what you really are." His fists clenched at his sides. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, voice low, dangerous. "You're destroying your own family." I let out a quiet breath, steadying myself before meeting his eyes one last time. "No, Dad," I said. "You did that a long time ago." Silence. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. I stood there, unmoving, as the car disappeared into the night. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. The fallout was swift and merciless. The morning after my father's visit, headlines exploded across every news outlet. "Scandal rocks mayoral candidate, abandoned son comes forward." Articles detailed Michael's story, the truth behind his existence, the carefully buried past that my father had spent decades erasing. His campaign tried to fight it. They scrambled to discredit the story, to paint Michael as an opportunist, to spin the narrative in any way they could. But there was no stopping it. Because the truth was out. And the truth was louder than any lie my father could tell. Within days, public support crumbled. Major donors pulled their funding. The campaign was in shambles. And then, just a week later, my father did what I had always known he would do the moment things became inconvenient for him. He quit. Richard Anderson, the man who had spent his entire life preaching about integrity, stood behind a podium, delivering a statement about stepping away for personal reasons. He didn't mention Michael. He didn't mention me. He barely even acknowledged the scandal that had destroyed his carefully built empire. But his face, his eyes, said everything. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as the powerful, untouchable man I had feared for so long. I saw him as what he truly was. Small. Weak. Afraid. And then, just like that, he disappeared from public life. My mother, always the devoted wife, followed him into the shadows. They moved away, retreating somewhere quiet, somewhere they wouldn't have to face the world that now knew who they really were. And Sophia? She stayed behind. One evening, not long after the scandal had settled, I heard a soft knock at my cafe's door after closing. When I turned, she was standing there, hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat, eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, uncertainty. I hesitated for only a second before unlocking the door. I wasn't sure if you'd let me in, she admitted. Neither was I said honestly. She let out a small, nervous laugh before stepping inside. I don't expect you to forgive me, Olivia. Not for everything. But I want to try. I want to be better. I studied her for a long moment, the weight of our past heavy between us. I don't know if things can ever go back to what they were, I said carefully. I don't either, she admitted. But maybe they don't have to. Maybe we can build something new. For the first time, I saw her as she was, not the golden child, not the perfect daughter my parents had molded her into, but a person who had been just as trapped as I had been. So I nodded. Okay. It wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a perfect resolution. But it was something. And then, there was Michael. He became a part of my life in a way I had never imagined possible. At first, we took things slow, occasional phone calls, emails, cautious steps towards something we had both been denied. But then, one afternoon, as Nathan sat at the kitchen table working on his homework, Michael rolled into the room, setting down a book in front of him. Your mom says you like history, he said. Nathan's eyes widened as he picked up the book. Yeah. Michael grinned. Then I think you'll like this one. And just like that, something inside me settled. This was my family now. Not the one I had been born into, but the one I had chosen. Ethan, standing beside me, his hand warm in mine. Nathan, laughing as he flipped through the pages of his new book. Michael, watching with quiet amusement, a brother I had never known but now couldn't imagine my life without. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Because family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the world turns its back. It's about the people who choose you, again and again, without conditions, without ultimatums. And I had finally found mine.